doesn't interest me if there is one God or many gods. I want to know if you belong or feel abandoned. If you know despair or can see it in others, I want to know if you are prepared to live in the world with its harsh need to change you. If you can look back with firm eyes, saying, "This is where I stand." I want to know if you know how to melt into that fierce heat of living, falling toward the center of your longing. I want to know if you are willing to live day by day with the consequences of love and the bitter, unwanted passion of your sure defeat. I have heard in that fierce embrace, even the gods speak of God.
I believe in personal responsibility and perpetual learning. My principles include kindness, authenticity, courage, and respect. I trust that life should have both purpose and joy. I find meaning in positive relationships, starting with myself. And I believe in open minds, loving hearts, and helping hands. Those words live on my refrigerator. I look at them every day. They are the core thoughts that define how I strive to live. But they're also clues to my faith. During my formative years, I was a hypocritical Catholic, a teenage intellectual atheist, a spiritually lost young adult. There's only been one constant that has fed my spiritual life. I am passionate about justice. Justice. During the recent question box sermon, Reverend Angela clarified that activism, the addressing of immediate needs in the community, and justice work, the striving to change the underlying systems, are both important. So whether it's volunteer work, political activism, philanthropy, community service projects, education, there are many roads that lead to justice. So today, when I refer to justice work, I am using the inclusive, broad stroke that includes all of these. So, back to my long-term commitment with justice. From starting my high school's recycling program, serving on the organizing team for Hands Across America, yes, I just aged myself, working on political campaigns, volunteering at numerous nonprofits, and creating community service programs in 4 schools, justice might just be the longest relationship I've ever had. And of course, now I've just finished my first year as the Justice Coordinator at First Unitarian Church. Oh, thank you. What are some of the things I've learned in this position this year? Our culture often confuses equality and equity. Many decent and generous people can still uphold indecent cultural systems. Diversity is about bodies, but inclusion is about culture. Ignorance is not the same as innocence. We sometimes replace generosity for justice. And we can mistakenly approach the work of justice by trying to change others. Well, this is entirely too much to unpack and examine for one Sunday. I would like to focus on just one of these right now. How we can mistakenly approach the work of justice by focusing on changing others instead of ourselves. It is so tempting to want to change a system, change somebody else, change the president, change the world. Yet I am constantly drawn back to the words of Mahatma Gandhi, "Be the change you want to see in the world." Recently, EarthWeb, our justice program that promotes and educates about sustainable environmental issues, began implementing better environmental practices to our social hour by providing compostable cups and more ecologically friendly coffee stirrers. Finding ways to implement these earth-friendly changes, communicate them to the large congregation, and coordinate with our valuable volunteers who work very hard to bring us coffee and snacks every Sunday can be a challenge. Now, we could mandate to people that you have to adopt these modifications. We could try to make them adapt and change. I mean, after all, the world's leading climate scientists released in the IPCC that there are only a dozen years remaining with which to act on global warming before it gets significantly worse. But I'm not going to do that. Instead, I'm going to be the change. I will use the cups and the stirrers and make sure to get them to the correct bin. I'm going to honor our interconnectedness by listening to everyone involved. And I'm going to engage the community in relationship. I mean, perhaps we all agree, but we just haven't had time to process it all. Or maybe there are obstacles that I haven't even thought about. If I were to implement a strict rule, I would invite resistance. But if I invest in the conversation, the relationship might guide us to all the potential solutions. So while I don't know the outcome of this project, I will live in my faith in the process. Who knows? Perhaps the final resolution will be infinitely better than I could have even imagined. You see, social justice is really the capacity to organize with others to accomplish ends that benefit the whole community. I draw from Carter Haywood. For God is nothing other than the eternally creative source of our relational power. And as Thich Nhat Hanh wrote, we must be peace in order to make peace. So when I read the lines from the poem from the reading, it doesn't interest me if there is one God or many gods. I want to know if you belong or feel abandoned. If you know despair or can see it in others. I understand those words to mean that rather than focusing on defining God or goddess, I can strive to know myself and others. And through those interactions are where I find the holy. You see, justice issues are often based in whether people feel they belong or feel abandoned. And the work requires us to see the despair in others and draw on the empathy we gain from knowing our own despair. How does an older, white, male General Motors factory worker feel this morning? A coal miner. Do they feel abandoned? Can we see despair in them? Does a young black man being pulled over by a police officer feel like he belongs? Can we, as individuals, look past the behaviors and see the need underneath? Can we recognize the despair of 63% of all U.S. citizens who don't have enough financial stability to survive one medical emergency? How about the almost 80% of U.S. workers who are currently living paycheck to paycheck? My faith is the link that keeps me focused on how to make these essential changes within myself, rather than spin my wheels attempting to alter others first. Once I'm able to keep my focus here, then when I step into the work, I'm able to be more effective because I can walk the walk. Maybe not every day, but enough. Robert Fulghum explained it as, peace is not something you wish for. It is something you make. It is something you are, something you do, and something you give away. If I am making peace, being peace, doing peace, giving away peace, then I am contributing to a more just world. And I am approaching the work of justice with the most effective tools: love, respect, courage, all firmly grounded in my beliefs. My faith calls me to start and end with love. See, love is an infinite resource. Robin Bartlett recently inspired me with her suggestion that we must continually choose to expand our concept of love until it is wasteful, extravagant, and as God-sized as we can make it. We must flex our heart muscles not only to include the least, the last, the lost, but also to include whomever we are currently referring to as snowflake or deplorable, instead of God's name for all of us, which is beloved. We must love one another without stopping to inquire whether we are worthy. I'm aiming for that extravagant love. I'm going to constantly bring myself back into the God that is the eternally creative source of our relational power. And as the poem from the reading goes, I want to know if you are prepared to live in this world with its harsh need to change you. If you can look with firm eyes, saying, "This is where I stand." I want to know if you know how to melt into that fierce heat of living, falling forward, the center of your longing. I want to know if you are willing to live day by day with the consequences of love and the bitter, unwanted passion of your sure defeat. I have heard in that fierce embrace, even the gods speak of God. Because no matter the defeat, no matter where you stand, I am willing to engage together. Because for me, justice is the face of God.
Faith is one of those tricky words. We might use it knowing what it means to us, but the person we're speaking it to hears it as they understand it, which might be quite different than we meant. Some people take faith to mean believing in something that isn't proven. And for these folks, the concept of faith might seem silly. Why would anyone believe in something that hasn't been proven? Or believe in something that there just isn't enough evidence for? And while the fifth source of our living tradition tells us to heed the guidance of reason and the results of science, nowhere does it say that science and reason are the sole or even the primary sources of wisdom for Unitarian Universalists. In fact, they are the fifth source out of 6 sources. That means direct experience, words and deeds of prophetic people, wisdom from the world's religions, teachings from Jewish and Christian teachings. Those are all listed prior to science and reason. Not to diminish their importance, but just to put them in perspective. So rather than saying that faith is merely believing in something unproven, I'd like to use a broader, more inclusive definition. I would say that faith is what we know to be true in the deepest, most authentic parts of ourselves. There are things we talk about knowing in our bones or in our gut. Faith recognizes that there are ways of knowing that go beyond the ability to intellectualize or analyze or interpret. Faith recognizes that there is a truth beyond words, a truth that lives in our emotions and in our bodies. It's a truth that can't hold back the tears when we're grieving, or the laughter when a moment of delight catches us by surprise. Now, I have to admit, the faith part of faith and justice has always been a stronger presence in my life. Quite the opposite of Beth's upbringing. I had very little engagement or involvement with justice work growing up. I've come to understand this as a result of my privilege. As a straight, cisgendered, white male, I had conceived of justice as how one individual should rightly treat another individual. Justice and morality existed purely on a person-to-person basis. I had no concept of systemic injustice, marginalization, or oppression. Instead, I grew up with that very individualistic lens. How should I live? What do I believe? What career should I pursue? Now, don't get me wrong, I wasn't completely self-absorbed. When I was in middle and high school, my Presbyterian youth group would do a service project every summer, but I never connected this kind of service work to the concept of justice. Again, I was very individualistic. I was merely helping people who needed assistance. I never stopped to wonder why the services were always provided in another part of town, far away from my church in the suburbs. But I knew that it was good and important to serve others. When I finished high school and started college, I found myself becoming even more focused on myself as I took classes and changed majors, trying to figure out what to do with my life. I was a full-time student with a serving job that covered rent, food, and not much else. So volunteering hardly ever crossed my mind. Spending time doing unpaid work just didn't make any sense to me. But while I was not very interested in volunteering, I did spend a lot of time wrestling with my beliefs. Shortly after starting college, I stopped attending the Presbyterian church I had grown up in. I began to find that the answers that were provided to my theological questions were feeling insufficient. And so I started to consider what else God might be, if not a man in the sky. Eventually, my theology grew to understand God as, in the words of St. Anselm, that than which nothing greater can be conceived. I could embrace this articulation of God because it left room for the mystery. After years of wrestling with questions of theology and meaning and purpose, my search for something I could believe in with my whole authentic self brought me to a Unitarian Universalist church. It was my faith journey and a desire for a deeper spiritual life that brought me to our living tradition. But it wasn't until I discovered Unitarian Universalism that I had any sense of why justice is important. And it wasn't immediate either. It took a while being around justice-oriented folks in the community that I found so welcoming as a spiritual seeker. But after some time, I started to understand that justice and faith are connected. A couple of years later, when I applied to seminary, I was worried that I didn't have enough volunteer experience. It was quite a jolt in that moment to realize how focused I had been nearly my whole life on my own experience. And this was a big moment for me. My theology shifted. Something about realizing how small my scope of living had been up until then made me realize how big the world actually is. And broadening my view of the world also helped me conceive of a God that was bigger and more expansive than I could have imagined before. I was able to understand God not as the creator of the universe, but the universe itself. Not merely the creator, but all of creation. And since then, my theology has continued to evolve. I'm quite struck by how similar my current theology is to Beth's. And I'm even more surprised that as much as we work together, I didn't really know anything about her theology until now, when she mentioned it in a sermon. Quoting Carter Hayward, she said, "God is the eternally creative source of our relational power." And this is my faith. I believe that God, the highest form of life energy in our universe, that than which nothing greater can be conceived, is co-created by you and me, by everyone who is gathered together in any place at any time. The divine is what we create together, and it is as good or as bad as we make it. And this is where the justice part comes in. Justice is the act of living into our faith. Having faith in something isn't enough. Just knowing something isn't enough. We have to apply it. We have to use what we know so we can live as best we know how. When we do the deep, reflective work to find the sources of truth within ourselves, we can't help but live according to what we find. Faith is what we know, and justice is how we are known. And the truth is, we're not isolated beings, living our own individual lives in a place where we only affect ourselves. We all share this same world. We are a part of something greater than ourselves. And this truth calls us to live responsibly and accountably for how we impact each other and the world that we share. When I talk to Unitarian Universalists about what attracts them to our faith, I almost always get one of two answers: our theological diversity or our commitment to justice. And while one or the other may have initially been more of a draw to you, my hope is that being part of this beloved community is nurturing both of those things in you. Maybe you relate more to Beth, who by living into her lifelong commitment to justice found herself looking into the face of God. Or maybe you relate more to my story, who came here with questions about faith and God and found that what we believe is directly related to what we do, that faith is what we know and justice is how we are known. Whatever brought you here, whatever keeps you here, may your faith continue to deepen and your commitment to justice continue to grow. May our hands do the work of our deepest truths as we live our faith into the world. May it be so.